Thank you for joining us on a webinar we have put together for you about the Alameda Lane Repurposing, which will go into detail on some of the data that we used to inform our current design. Go ahead. So first of all, I want to restate our goals for this project. Our goals have not changed since we started the planning to now when we're moving forward with the design. So our goals are to maintain safety and access for drivers along the corridor, which goes hand in hand with the second goal to reduce crashes. We do want to enhance safety for all users, including pedestrians and cyclists. We want to support transit service. We know that Alameda serves as a very popular bus line and bus route. And then we want to support businesses at access and activity where we can. So I'm going to give a little background on the community engagement that we have done to date on this project. Some of you may remember, some of you may not. We started this project in 2018 and probably even before then. But what really kicked it off is turn restrictions that we implemented at Corona and Alameda. And we did that because we saw a high number of crashes along the corridor, specifically at this intersection. There were a number of neighbors that had reached out to us, and we kept getting 311s just about how dangerous this particular intersection was and the intersections surrounding it. So we went ahead and did not allow turns on Corona and Alameda. Post that, we did a 2-year kind of study on what those turn restrictions did. So in 2020, we held a virtual open house. This lives on our YouTube channel where we kind of discussed the findings from this study. And we actually found that crashes had been reduced at Corona and Alameda. So this allowed us to actually see from a more holistic perspective what we could do to further prevent crashes along Alameda, to further make the corridor safer, again, with all users in mind. But if we could stretch that from possibly Franklin all the way to Pearl. So in between 2020 and 2024, you didn't hear from us that much about Alameda. Part of that was because we went into COVID and funding was up in the air. So we secured funding during this time and actually got a consultant, Kimley Horn, on board to really look at the data that had resulted from the Corona and Alameda after study and actually gather more data about volume and speed along Alameda to see at this point if the road diet or lane repurposing would help with mitigate the crash picture we were seeing here. Then in 2024, we had a public meeting. It was March 2024 at Lincoln Elementary. And this was kind of what came out of that process with Kimley Horn. We now had a design of lane repurposing. We introduced the full lane reduction here. We had roll plots on the wall, and about 50 people showed up at that point. And I will say I was in attendance, and the result was very mixed. Some people were very much in favor of the full lane reduction at this point, and some people were not. So let's jump to 2025, because when we left that public meeting as staff, we knew that implementation was on the horizon, but we didn't have an exact time period. So it wasn't until February 2025 that we went ahead and sent out an email. Again, it was from people that had shown interest in the project, which had mostly been at that public meeting in April. We sent an email to only 51 people, which is about right for like a neighborhood project. That said, we're moving forward with the design that we presented at the public meeting, and we will start construction in summer of 2025. Um, and then in March, shortly after we sent that email, the Alameda Underpass construction project started. And I only say this because I think this added to a story of what was going on along Alameda at this time. We saw increased levels of congestion because of the Alameda Underpass project, which I think led to some of the reaction that I'm going to talk about here, the opposition of being like, wow, there's a lot of construction happening right here. And it also forced us to say, okay, maybe summer 25 isn't the right time to add another construction project on to what was already a strained Alameda, a strained corridor. But at this point, we thought, we were going gangbusters and going to move forward with construction. So in April, myself, along with a colleague, we flyered the neighborhood, and we basically put a Dear Neighbor letter on all the residences that lined Alameda. And we went face to face and met with businesses as well as several business owners. It was still all the businesses we met with at this point. It was more of an informational meeting. They wanted more information. At this point, we did not hear any opposition to what the plan was for the full reduction. We were communicated with by a group of neighbors who largely lived on the east side of the project in June, asking for a meeting. We scheduled this meeting. We met with them, and they voiced their opposition at this point to the design. They brought us up several points. Our team it was a discussion. We talked about again, reiterating the goals of the project, why we thought the full lane reduction was the way to go. At this point, again, it was just a conversation, nothing formal until July, when we got a petition that included this group of neighbors, as well as 300 and more signatories. It was, I think, it was 321. And this petition was signed by Jill Anschutz and addressed to the mayor and included the 300 signatures. It was 7 different points about what they thought were wrong with the direction we were headed in the full lane reduction, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It didn't take long shortly thereafter in August to get a separate petition supporting the efforts that had already happened, the full lane reduction, and that was spearheaded by a group called Safer Alameda. So I want to be transparent about what we heard from the petition spearheaded by Jill Anschutz. And these are the 7 things we heard. I don't need to read them all to you. I will just make note of the top 3, which are highlighted here, because those are the things when we went back and relooked at the data, which when 300 people write into the mayor and write into Dottie, we look at it. We take it seriously. We look at it. And in this instance, we relooked at some data. Again, the process had started in 2018. There was some new volumes that we could get. There was a new crash picture that we can get. I'll let Stephen get into the details of what the data was. But we really found out of these 7 things that we took them all seriously, but the things that rose to the top is like, okay, legitimate. Let's look at this and be sure the full lane reduction is the best design forward. Was the concern over traffic congestion, side street diversion, and then specifically the risk to Virginia Avenue, which if you live in the neighborhood, is just adjacent to Washington Park. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Stephen, who really dove in on the numbers. He is the engineer to kind of walk us through the data and why we ended up pivoting our design.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. Yeah, so we wanted to first start talking about congestion and travel times. And so the work that's being presented on this and the next slide is from our Kimberly Horn consultant team, and it's the analysis that was originally done during the alternatives evaluation. And you can see we were specifically focused on Alameda itself in the eastbound and westbound directions, and this is between Pearl and Franklin. And you can see that we were looking at the average travel times along the corridor. And you can see the existing travel times about 3.5 minutes. It varies a little bit today, if there's some congestion on the road or not, and by period. But you can see that's sort of the baseline scenario. And then we have three alternatives that have been presented. So I'm going to step through each of those. And so that evaluation first looked at a full lane repurposing, which was the original design. And you can see that there's about a 1.5-minute travel time increase in the eastbound direction in the afternoon when we were looking at that scenario. And so when we step back and look at a 1.5-minute delay, we think, yes, there's probably going to be people who decide to divert off the corridor. And so the second scenario, full lane repurposing with diversion, accounts for 10% reduction in through traffic on Alameda. And you can see it in that case, the travel times are roughly equivalent, 10 seconds more to what we see today. And so it's reasonable to think that if we do the full lane repurposing scenario, that we will have 10% of traffic leave the corridor and be using our local streets, parallel local streets, in order to avoid, the delays that are being caused by this improvement. The third column, we have the partial lane repurposing. So originally during that study, this study time, this scenario was also looked at, which is very similar to the current configuration that we are moving towards. And you can see this included one lane in the westbound direction being converted into that center turn lane with pockets, turn lane pockets. And the most increase in travel time is in the westbound direction, which you might expect at about 20 seconds. And so this is really the travel time picture that we see from these various options that we have. Next, we'll look at queuing. And so the travel time is one thing, and then what are the impacts to traffic congestion and the number of vehicles that will be on Alameda, perhaps sitting at traffic lights waiting for the green. And so that's really what this slide shows. And this analysis shows the existing configuration, and that's the generally shorter arrows closer to Alameda on the inside, and then the after scenario. And this slide shows specifically the full lane repurposing in the AM and PM periods with that 10% diversion. So this assumes that 90% of the Alameda traffic is on Alameda, and this is what the queuing will look like. And so you can see there are locations with, queues of more than 10 vehicles in both directions during the travel day. And so this is, that second piece of the congestion picture and story. And I think the interesting thing about looking at this scenario, which is with diversion, and looking at the partial repurposing numbers, they're actually very similar. So the partial lane repurposing configuration can handle all of the traffic, 100% of the traffic, with about the same queues as a diverted full lane repurposing project would. And so the final piece of the story, and those three topics that Molly pointed out from the letter, is really the story of Virginia Avenue. And so we did get an opportunity to go back and look at more recent crash data along Virginia, just to see, what the current crash picture is. This will be over the last 5 years, and where hotspots maybe along the corridor. And you can see that there were three locations, Lincoln, Downing, and Logan, which each had a number of crashes and represented a significant share of the crashes. And when we dived even deeper into the crash history, we were able to identify crash patterns at the intersection of Downing and Virginia, which is, right on the northwest corner of Wash Park. And importantly, we have vulnerable road users that have been in crashes at that location. We had 2 pedestrian crashes and 2 bicycle crashes. And so based on this analysis, we don't think our project that we're recommending is going to cause a lot of diversion, but we still want to be out there protecting our vulnerable users. So we're looking to implement some safety-focused, vulnerable user-focused improvements at Downing, Virginia, which Molly will go through in a minute on the recommendation slide.
Thanks, Stephen. So now this is basically a summary of what we just talked about and the justification we see to pivot from the full lane reduction or from nothing to the partial lane reduction. And I will go through this very briefly since Stephen did such a good job of, I think, explaining kind of what we're thinking here and the actual data behind it. But basically, if we look at the potential for crash reduction, both the partial and the full will do that, and it's relatively the same percentages. Pedestrian safety, we believe, is good for both. We're still putting an RFB actually as a separate, I'll talk about it in terms of timeline, but at Franklin and Alameda. And then the diversion impacts are really the crux of what we're talking about here. I think the full lane reduction absolutely looked at Alameda and what we could do to make specifically Alameda safer, while the partial lane reduction really looks from a more holistic perspective of everything that's going on within the neighborhood and is moving forward to provide safety measures for those side streets and really looking at the diversion as being a legitimate and real concern. And then you can see safety at signalized intersections. It's still good. We're doing the same thing. We're keeping a lot of the same design elements. And then congestion, as Stephen eloquently said in the slides, that really that partial lane reduction also will just make it so queuing is not exacerbated at this point. We know there's already queuing there, but the full lane reduction, we were really concerned with travel times. And so this is just an example that we wanted to see. We are making a more legible and prettier graphic, but this shows kind of the top shows the existing condition of this is Emerson and Ogden Street along Alameda, and the bottom kind of shows what we're talking about, just so you can get a better visual picture here of what we're referring to when we're saying we're doing a center lane and it's going to allow for turn pockets. You can hopefully see that here. There will be a lot more. We're hoping north-south. Going north-south here will be easier and safer, more importantly, and that there will still allowing the center lanes for the left crashes will hopefully reduce the left crash picture that we're seeing. That is our primary safety concern along the corridor. So I'm not going to go through all of this. Again, this lives on our website. I encourage you to read it, pause here on the video. But this really goes through the changes with the partial repurposing and then what we're keeping from the previous design. So you can see we're keeping many of the same elements that we believe met the goals of bringing safety along the whole corridor, the neighborhood. And then the partial repurposing, of course, is changing the lanes we're maintaining the 2-lane eastbound and then 1-lane westbound. Again, we'll put up a graphic for this. So, and then a big change here is also signals. So we're going to upgrade signals at Pearl and Emerson, and then that Virginia Downing, looking to do safety improvements there as well. And so the updated timeline here is now we unfortunately do have to go into a redesign period, and that's happening as we speak until June 2026, roughly. Then we will get a contractor on board by October 2026, and then construction will happen between November and September of 2027. So obviously this is quite a delay of when we had said this project would be signed, sealed, delivered, but we really do think we are bringing a better end product, something that really is going to enhance the safety for the whole neighborhood. And so we will be moving forward on that. And then I did mention the installation of the RRFB at Alameda and Franklin, which includes a refuge island and crosswalks, is still going forward. And it's actually, we've put that separately to move forward. And we're hoping that that actually gets installed at the beginning of 2026, weather permitting, and that contracting still has to be worked out. So, but it's moving forward and it's funded, and we are trying to get that installed as quick as possible. So if you've made it to here, thank you so much for listening. You can look at our website. We will keep updating it for the latest and greatest information, which is where this lives. My contact information is on there should you have any questions. And we really thank you as we continue to move forward with this project and continue to engage the community. Thanks so much.